Welcome to LUTV News InFocus, where we feature interesting topics on campus, in the community, and in the world of culture. I'm Claire Robertson. March 3rd, Texan voters took part in Super Tuesday. Super Tuesday is when 14 states vote in the primary election, and about 1/3 of presidential delegates will be allotted to candidates. Associate Professor Dr. James Nelson specializes in American politics, political behavior, and public policy. Dr. Nelson is here to analyze the results of the Texas primaries and discuss how Vice President Joe Biden won the state and how Texans might vote in the presidential election this year. Right. Thank you so much for being with me today. Just to get started, could you tell me a little bit about Biden's victory in Texas and the close competition with Bernie Sanders?
Well, first off, it's important to note that he did win Texas, but by a fairly slim margin, by a couple of percentage points in a divided field where Mike Bloomberg was still in the race and also got about 15% or so. And it's also important to note when we're thinking about this, he did win Texas, but it's not the same as winning Texas in the general election cycle in the fall when Texans will be deciding who they want to be the president. This is a contest within the Democratic Party among Texas Democrats for whom they want their delegates to be awarded to. Who do Texas Democrats want to sort of represent them as their presidential candidate? And Biden won that by a few percentage points, partially by being dominant in most of the counties of the state. However, some of the more progressive counties like Travis County, Bernie Sanders did better, and Sanders also did better closer to the Texas-Mexico border in some of those counties, and that he benefited somewhat from his campaign's reach out to Latin American voters in that respect. That's within Texas, the population demographics vary pretty widely in different parts of the state in terms of race, ethnicity, and a number of different social dimensions. And it's a part of the state that in places has very large majorities of Latin American voters. And he did well there, and he did well in some more progressive areas like Travis County, which has Austin in it.
Why do you think, or let me rephrase, what do you think Texans see in Joe Biden that they voted for him?
Well, I think Bernie Sanders he does represent the progressive wing of the party, like sort of the far left wing of the party, where a lot of them want the party to go. But that's more likely to be a winning message among, say, Massachusetts or Washington or Oregon Democrats than, say, it is among Texas Democrats. As you see in the election results, there is a sizable minority that picked Sanders, but Biden's message is more likely to be a winning one, where he would largely sort of build on what happened in the Obama years, was looking for less radical reforms of a lot of institutions. And also Biden benefits from his ties to a relatively popular recent Democratic president. Among voters who identify as Democrats, when asked, did Obama do a good job as president, the answer is pretty much always over 90% of them at least say yes. He may not be their favorite president, but he's generally well-liked by Democratic voters to a very large degree. And Biden's ties to him have definitely benefited Vice President Biden in this campaign.
So would you say that Sanders might have been harmed by not being in the national spotlight as long?
That's part of it as well, that prior to his 2016 campaign, he was sort of a regional figure. He was a representative from a state that not many people follow all that closely, then a senator from that same state. And he also had kind of been outside of the party in some ways. He wasn't formally a Democrat till he ran for president in 2016. So he's consistent. I mean, people who like him like the fact that he's had a similar message since the 1980s, so he probably really does believe what he says. But he represents sort of the far left part of the Democratic Party and also was kind of a regional figure until maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Can I ask what you expected to see out of the primary election and if you were surprised at the results?
Well, to be honest, before Super Tuesday, even a few days before Super Tuesday, I was thinking of different scenarios in my head in terms of who is going to move ahead and who's not, because far more candidates were still in the race. Pete Buttigieg was still in the race at that point. Amy Klobuchar was still in the race at that point. There were those two in particular were still pretty viable candidates. Bloomberg was still in the race, but I thought he didn't have much of a chance, but especially, he even wrote off the few initial states, and he's also a former Republican. He has a number of other issues working against him. But there were multiple people in the race, and I was seeing, who's going to juggle into position, essentially. But I always thought Biden had a pretty good shot at that, and I thought he'd do somewhat well in Super Tuesday, as a matter of how well. But I honestly thought Bernie and Biden would be, two people who would do well, but I wasn't sure sort of how that less progressive wing was going to play out, like whether Biden would become this sort of counter to Bernie. Because before Super Tuesday, there did seem to be a couple of other contenders. It looked like Klobuchar might have turned her campaign around, or somebody else might have, but that didn't happen, and they both kind of saw the writing on the wall that Biden, for those voters, was probably going to do better, so they both dropped out. And on Super Tuesday, Warren was still in the race, but her campaign had sort of already been declining at that point, so I assumed that Bernie Sanders was probably going to be the preferred choice of voters with that viewpoint, that Warren is also popular among progressive voters, but Bernie Sanders seemed to be doing a better job reaching that base. So it looked like Warren was probably, if she didn't drop out shortly after Super Tuesday, her campaign would have probably fizzled out when donations started drying up, when people started seeing that Bernie Sanders is really sort of where this voting base is going.
So looking forward to the 2020 presidential election, do you think that there is enough excitement among Texan Democrats that the state could possibly flip to a blue state?
I would say that's possible, but I think it's less likely than some observers expect. It's possible, but if I had to put a probability on it, I would put it at maybe 15 or 20%. Texas is trending to where it's a more competitive state, but that would be a pretty big turnaround of, close to 9 or 10 points versus what happened last time. And that's a big turnaround in one presidential election cycle. So unless there's a big surge in youth turnout or some other unforeseen change, just the general incremental changes that happen between election cycles, I think Trump most likely will win the general election in Texas, the Texas electoral vote, but there's a good chance he'll win it by less than he did last time. I mean, that Texas is trending more competitive. And also, he does have some baggage going into this. He's been president for a few years, so he's had a few years of decisions to alienate some voters with. Of course, many others will stay with him. Like I said, I think he's more likely than Biden, who looks like the presumptive nominee now to win Texas. But I don't think Trump is going to win it by a massive margin. I think he'll win by something comparable to what he did last time, or maybe a little less so.
Assuming that Biden is the presidential nominee, and you said one of his strengths is his long history in public service, Donald Trump, even though he's been the president for 4 years, doesn't have that long history. So what do you think voters see in him?
Well, it depends on the voter. And you would see, Biden, one of his strengths is his history in public service. Another strength he has just going in that Trump also has is large percentages of the American people have already made their minds up. Most voters predictably vote for one party or the other. And we don't see the kind of swings from election to election we used to in the 70s and 80s at the presidential level. In terms of the overall voting public, most people in my position would argue that only about maybe 10% or so are what are called true independents. A lot of people identify as independents, but then still vote Democratic or vote Republican most of the time. There's only a slim number of voters that could genuinely go either way. And that's something they kind of both have going for them, is that about 40% or more of the country basically is going to vote for Vice President Biden, and about another similar percentage is going to vote for Donald Trump. But there are still some people who may be persuadable, but not many. And yeah, one of Biden's strengths is his ties to President Obama, who is a very popular figure among voters who identify as Democrats. And that's part of his long history of public service, is that the last 8 years of it, he was a nationally known figure. Some of the time prior to that, he may not have been as well known nationally. He was a senator from a very small state, Delaware, which isn't discussed much in the national media. One of the things Trump has going for him is literally that he won last time. He just has to do what he did. If he just replicates the success he had in the states, he did it last time. He has the playbook from when he won last time. However, he did win narrowly in some ways last time. He won all the states Republicans are expected to win. He won the southeastern states. He won a lot of the farm states in the middle of the country, Kansas, Nebraska, that area. He won the Mountain West, Idaho, Montana, those kinds of places. So he won all the places he was expected to win, but he also flipped a number of those closely divided states, Ohio, Florida. Also, he won in some of those closely divided states Republicans haven't won in a while, like Pennsylvania and Michigan, and particularly Wisconsin. Wisconsin was a big pickup for him. Republicans had not won that in presidential elections since the 90s. Normally, Democrats have been winning that state, but not by huge margins. And so his strength is he's won before, but that strength is also, a somewhat tenuous one.
And Joe Biden would also have that because he was part of a winning ticket.
He was part of a winning ticket
Right.
as well. I mean, several years prior. The last time he did was in 2012. But yeah, Biden, that's a strength he has as well, and that's something he can try to build on. That some of those states that Trump managed to flip, Biden was part of a ticket that won those before. Like, Obama won Wisconsin, Obama won Michigan, and those places. But a couple interesting things to note along with this are that Politico in particular now is framing Ohio as kind of a red state as opposed to a purple state. And it is trending that direction, and there's some evidence for that. That even though the Democrats had a good year in 2018 where they won a number of House seats that might not have been expected to win, Ohio is a closely divided state, but the Republicans still dominated the state offices there. And Trump did win Ohio by a pretty sizable margin. So it looks like Texas is trending one way. Ohio is a big state, but not quite as big as Texas, and they're kind of trending another way. So it's likely Trump will win Ohio again. Also, we asked about Texas and whether Texas would flip. That's possible, but somewhat remote. An acquisition that the Trump campaign has their eyes on and they've been working on is Minnesota. He narrowly lost Minnesota, and they're hoping to flip that one. Also, if I were to project a state that has gone Republican a lot in the past 20 years that the Democrats might flip, I would think that Georgia is probably more likely than Texas because Trump won Georgia by a narrower margin last time than he won Texas, and Georgia is kind of trending in the same direction where it's more competitive.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for watching LUTV News in Focus. To see more content from LUTV News, follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook.